What exactly happened at Fukushima is still not known.
What we really need to know is what's inside what looks like smoke, but could in fact be steam. And we know that the authorities said they were going to try and reduce the pressure through a release of steam. That initial release would probably have been within the containment concrete structure itself. That may have been damaged, and it may have then exploded due to the increase of pressure inside, due to the steam alone.
Such is the concern about nuclear risk that the Prime Minister visited the site before the explosion and then afterwards tried to reassure the nation.
By taking all these appropriate measures, we would like to avoid any situations where people's health is damaged.
The devastating quake has ruptured much of Japan's key infrastructure, damaging supply lines and this oil refinery. But the threat to the nuclear plants makes the stakes far more worrying. Nuclear energy accounts for 30% of Japan's electricity. On huge modern screens, they watch the disaster unfold as scientists check the power plants for radiation leaks. Humphrey Hawksley, BBC News.
A government spokesman says that although the building itself was destroyed by the blast, a steel container with a nuclear reactor inside was not, and that's pretty crucial. Earlier, my colleague Maxime Marwini spoke to Walt Patterson. He's a nuclear physicist, an associate fellow at Chatham House, and she asked him what could have caused the explosion.
There must have been something that blew up, and you really have only two major options in the context of a nuclear plant. And the most likely one is a hydrogen explosion, in which case you have had fuel in the reactor which has been exposed enough to melt somewhat, and the molten fuel then reacts with the water to produce hydrogen in sufficient quantity that it can then be ignited and explode. And that was a big explosion, so a significant amount of hydrogen. Alternatively, it might have been a steam explosion, in which case that would indicate that the reactor itself was damaged. And I gather that the authorities say that's not the case.
Yes,
so
what they're actually saying is the metal container sheltering a nuclear reactor was not affected by the explosion that destroyed the building that it is in.
That sounds plausible. That sounds as though there usually is a particular so-called containment, which is supposed to be a high-integrity shell around the actual reactor itself, and all the rest of the ancillary buildings are outside that containment.
What do you make of this thought that we've been hearing that they may be trying to bring in seawater to cool it down?
I can only assume that it's because they're short of water on the site, because seawater is certainly a drastic remedy as far as the reactor itself is concerned.
Why is that? Because
it's got all sorts of corrosive materials in the seawater. I mean, this reactor will now be a write-off. I mean, simply in terms of the asset itself, they are effectively conceding that this reactor will never restart.
Let's now talk to Sean Burney. He's a nuclear consultant for Greenpeace, and he's in our Carlisle newsroom this afternoon. A very good afternoon to you. I just wanted to put to you what the Japanese government spokesman are saying, that the metal container sheltering the nuclear reactor was not affected by this explosion, and that the radiation around the plant didn't rise but is instead decreasing. Now, this can only be good news.
If that was true, that would be good news. Unfortunately, they're still in the middle of a crisis. If it is indeed the case that the vessel that contains the reactor fuel is intact, the next question is, how are they managing to continue to cool the fuel inside that vessel? And as we've heard over the last 24 hours, reassuring statements from Japanese government officials, from industry spokespeople, that everything was under control. And as you saw this morning, clearly they weren't, because we've lost the containment building, which means now there is only one barrier, the pressure vessel, the steel vessel, between the reactor fuel, where all the radioactivity is, and the public environment.
What are your views on the way it's being handled on the ground? People have been moved away now, and they've been moved away again to an even wider exclusion zone.
I've worked in Japan for over 20 years and have been in Japan at the time of nuclear accidents. Nothing is ever serious as this. What you find is that the regulators and the operators of the nuclear installations, their first instinct is not to tell the truth. The first instinct is to be economical with the truth, to only provide small amounts of information. To give them some credit, this is clearly in the middle of an earthquake disaster, so communications have clearly been confusing for the regulators and government officials. However, over 20 years, the industry and government have demonstrated that they are not good at communicating what the actual situation is on the ground.
As you say, though, sorry to interrupt you, but as you say, though, it's very quite difficult to get information from there at the moment.
More than 24 hours ago, when I was working on this issue with colleagues in the United States, in Japan and in the UK, it was our assessment that there was very likely to be a reactor core fuel melt. That was not being talked about by the government. It was not being talked about by the independent experts from Imperial College and other places, because they have a vested interest in downplaying the risks of nuclear power. What we now have during the night is 90 centimetres, which is perhaps a half of the core, was exposed to air, which means large amounts of radioactivity is building up inside the reactor pressure vessel and then into the containment. And obviously, if the containment has indeed been blown apart, probably due to a hydrogen explosion, the next question is, what is happening to the radioactive fuel inside the reactor vessel? Are they able to keep that cool or not?
Well, those are the questions that remain unanswered at the moment. Sean Burney, Head of Nuclear Policy at Greenpeace, thank you.
The International Atomic Energy Agency says it's urgently seeking further information into the cause of the blast at the complex, which is about 250 kilometres north of Tokyo. Take a look at these pictures. They show the moment of the explosion. And as you can see there, a cloud of smoke billows into the sky. Only the metal framework of the building remains intact. 4 workers were hurt. Officials had earlier warned that the reactor was threatened with partial meltdown after its cooling system failed following the earthquake. Let's get a report from Mike Waldridge.
The explosion at the nuclear power station, captured on Japanese television, appears to have destroyed a building housing the reactor, according to the latest reports. The utility running the plant says 4 workers suffered fractures and bruises and are being treated in hospital. What's not clear at the moment, and critically important, is what's in the clouds we see here, rising from the damaged plant.
It's not quite clear yet exactly what was inside that cloud. And that's really the key issue as to how much radiation was released during this explosion.
The Fukushima nuclear complex is about 150 miles northeast of Tokyo, and it's the #1 plant that's giving rise to all the concern. The authorities initially told residents living within a 10-kilometre radius that they should evacuate the area. That's now been widened to 20 kilometres. The earthquake damaged the plant's cooling system. Experts say that although the reactors appear to have been shut down safely after the earthquake, they still need to be cooled constantly to avoid a meltdown of the core. But in the latest development, Japan's Nuclear Safety Agency says the explosion is unlikely to have caused any serious damage to the reactor itself. And Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary has sought to reassure people living near the Fukushima reactor.
This explosion reported is not concerning the container within the reactor. Therefore, there is no possibility that radioactive substance will be leaked in a substantial manner.
These pictures of derailed trains from the region hardest hit by the disaster around the city of Sendai, which is only around 80 miles from the earthquake's epicenter offshore, are a graphic illustration of the destructive power of the combination of the biggest quake ever recorded in Japan and the tsunami that surged inland in its aftermath, sweeping all before it. A petrochemical complex near Sendai still burns well after 24 hours after the earthquake. The authorities are only beginning to make an assessment of the scale of the damage, and with so much still underwater, it will clearly be a long time before an accurate forecast can be made of the cost of reconstruction. For now, and probably for days to come, it's still the search for survivors that obviously has priority, and rescue workers are making their way through the murky, debris-strewn waters in boats and by any other means of transport available to look for people. Although Tokyo is 250 miles away from the epicenter, it was shaken hard by the earthquake. Its transport systems remain seriously affected, and its people deeply worried. Mike Waldridge, BBC News.
Well, we have been, of course, hearing from the Japanese Prime Minister Naito Tan said that he had been speaking to President Obama. He gave us this update in the past hour or so.
Considering these situations, our number one priority, of course, is the safety of people in the surrounding area, and we are taking appropriate measures. At Fukushima number one nuclear plant, as to the number one reactor, there has been a new development, and the Chief Cabinet Secretary will be talking about it later in details. And due to this development, 10 kilometers surrounding the reactor or the plant is evacuated. But that evacuation zone has been actually expanded to 20 kilometers. By taking all these appropriate measures, we would like to avoid any situations where people's health is damaged. I would like you to pay attention to the reports by the government and also by the media, and I'd like you to take responsible actions. I have actually received a call from Mr. Obama and other leaders of the world, more than 50 or 60 countries in the world. They have extended their sympathies to us. And we are requesting helps from them as well. First, we need to save lives. And then, we need to make it easier for people who are in the shelters based on the experience that we learned from Kobe. And after that, we will have to make efforts in order to reconstruct. There has been some party leader meetings. We would like to cooperate together. And they have actually extended their willingness to cooperate with us. This is an unprecedented disaster that we are suffering. And each person, and with their support, government and local government will have to overcome the situation, overcome this hardship. And we will be a new Japan. That is what I'd like to ask you. Well, that is what I'd like to promise to you. And that is what I'd like to ask you. Thank you very much for your cooperation.
Let's take a look at these pictures from the Japanese public broadcaster NHK. It shows the scale of destruction in Minamisaniku, where media reports say half the population is unaccounted for.
This is the hospital building. This is a 5-storied building, but the water came in up to the 4th floor. And as of shortly before 300 patients were waiting to be evacuated. And this is Minami Sanrik town before the earthquake hit.